All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Katie Estrada, and I'm the Executive Director of Classy, and I'm excited to welcome you all here tonight. June's a special month because we're offering not one, but two free webinars for you. We've got our wonderful presentation this evening on the Fidelity Measure, and then next Tuesday, June 25th, we will be having a second free webinar with Sue Troutman. And Sue, I see you in the room, so welcome, and we look forward to your session next week. And that session will be June 25th at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And the topic is help. What do these test scores mean, and how do you get to a conclusion? So I'm sure that is a very useful topic that I'm sure a lot of you will come prepared with some great questions. But for this evening, we're going to dive a little deeper into the Fidelity Measure. And we have Dr. Melisa Kaye with us. And we're excited to have her here for this sixth conversation that she's led. And Dr. Melisa Kaye has been an occupational therapist for 21 years. She is the founder and director of Firefly Center Therapy Services for Children in the San Francisco Bay Area. And she is also a university instructor and currently teaches at San Jose.
Thanks, Katie. Welcome, everyone. Glad to see so many people turn up for this webinar. This is a new topic that I'm presenting on, which is the Fidelity Measure. For those of you that have been to past webinars, this topic kept coming up over and over, and folks wanted more information. So we're going to devote an entire session tonight to the Fidelity Measure. And what I'll do is go through the measure and then show you a video clip and talk about how the Fidelity Measure works in practice, and then open it up for questions at the end. So because the video is of children who have given their permission to, their families have given permission to be recorded, we are not going to record it for future use, just due to confidentiality issues. So what we'll do is at the end of the lecture, we'll stop the recording, and then I'll show you the video, and then we can either start recording again or just take questions. So without further ado, I'm going to get started. The document that we're talking about tonight, for those of you that are not familiar with it, is called the Ayres Sensory Integration Fidelity Measure. And it was published in 2003 by Parham, Smith Rowley, Malo, Kumar, Bay Menson, Brett Green, Burke, Cohn, Miller, and Schaff. The purpose of the Fidelity Measure is to assure the fidelity of occupational therapy intervention based on the sensory integration theory and principles developed originally by A. Jean Ayres. So what does that mean? Well, basically, what we wanted to do was to have a tool that we could use, and this is a questionnaire and fill-in kind of tool, and I'll show you some sample pages from it in a little while. But we needed a tool to identify when therapists were actually doing Ayres sensory integration and when they were doing therapeutic processes that were something else besides Ayres sensory integration. There's some key elements to the document, and here they are in shorthand. The reason that we use the Fidelity Measure is to document intervention accurately. So when a child is receiving intervention and someone is calling it Ayres sensory integration, we want to be able to, when we say yes, Ayres sensory integration is going on, we want to be accurate in that statement. And so you'll see when we get into the kind of the meat of the Fidelity Measure that there are certain parts and pieces and processes that make intervention Ayres sensory integration. All right, number two, another key element is that intervention is in accordance with theory and procedures. So Dr. Ayres had very specific ways of conducting therapy sessions. She had a very particular theory that had a number of tenets that we've gone over in previous lectures, and you probably are familiar with, for example, the just right challenge, the adaptive response, etc. Another key element, number 3, is that when we use the fidelity measure, we're able to monitor treatment and use it for research studies. So if we're sure that what we're doing is Ayres Sensory Integration, and I'm doing it in San Francisco, and another group is doing it in Los Angeles, California, and another group is doing it in Portugal, and another group is doing it in New York, we are reasonably sure that we are all doing the same thing. And so if we were to have a research study where we wanted to gather research about the efficacy of Ayres Sensory Integration, we would want to know as best as we could that we were all following the same protocol. So in terms of this age-old kind of debate of whether or not sensory integration, quote unquote, works, the best way that we can do that is to operationalize it. In other words, have certain standards for what constitutes Ayres SI, so that when we do research, we're sure that what's happening actually conforms to the definition of Ayres Sensory Integration. The final key element, number 4, is that the fidelity measure helps us differentiate ASI, or Ayres Sensory Integration, from other interventions. And we're not putting any sort of value judgment on whether other things are better or worse than ASI. All we're saying is that when we're doing ASI, we want to be able to explain and define how it's different from other types of interventions. In this fidelity measure document, there's 2 different sections. There's one on structure and a second one on process, and we'll be talking about each in turn. This is a sample cover page, and it's probably a little bit small for you to read, but I have put in sample pages of the document throughout so you can get an idea of the flavor of it and how it's designed. And what you'll see on the top is the essential characteristics of occupational therapy using Ayres Sensory Integration intervention. So basically those key elements. You'll also notice that there's a rater, a case, and an observation number. So when, say, I'm a therapist who wants to participate in research, someone else is actually going to observe me and rate me on a number of different measures to say either yes, she's doing Ayres Sensory Integration, or no, she's not, or she kind of is, but not enough to really be included in a research study. The first piece that we're going to go over is the structure of the fidelity measure. And most of these items are something called essential elements, and they're either a go or no-go item. In other words, you either have this going on or you don't have it going on. The first criteria is therapist qualifications. What we're looking for to qualify as ASI is postgraduate training in Ayres Sensory Integration. The OT providing intervention should be SI or SIP certified with a minimum of 50 hours of SI theory and practice, and have supervision. So a history of mentorship with an advanced level therapist who has at least 5 years of experience providing OT using ASI intervention for at least 1 year. So 2 things. One is this formal training. The other is that you're actually working with someone who already has a lot of experience doing ASI. The next element is a safe environment. So some of the factors that are involved, when you read them, it makes logical sense, but we want to spell everything out. So the floor beneath the suspended equipment needs to be padded with cushions or pillows, so everything is safe. The equipment needs to be adjustable to this child's size. It needs to be easily monitored for safe use. Unused equipment needs a space to be put out of the way or stored so no one can trip or fall on it. And the equipment has to be routinely and frequently monitored for wear and tear. For example, frayed ropes or bungee cords get replaced, loose bolts get secured, etc. So you'll notice that the first element was about the therapist. This element is about the environment. The next piece is about assessment. So we want to have historical information about the child. That's what the HX stands for, historical, medical, educational, therapeutic, and developmental history. We want to have current information from an occupational profile or interview. We want to have a reason for referral and activities that the child currently seeks and enjoys. The next aspect is assessment results. So we'll want to have assessment results that pertain directly to the child's sensory processing and integration, but also assessment results that have to do with more general domains of development like visual, perceptual, and fine motor skills, gross motor skills, praxis, organizational skills, etc. And then finally, if we recommend ASI intervention, we want to have goals and objectives that are developed in collaboration with caregivers. The goals focus on the presenting concerns and are based on the assessment findings, and that they focus on improving skills and abilities to enhance performance. So just a brief word about that last one. So the goals focus on improved skills and abilities to enhance performance. So from an occupational therapy perspective and also from an SI perspective, we don't want to have goals like they will improve 1 standard deviation on, test number 17 on the SIPT, right? So we don't want to have goals that kind of reduce the child down to performing in terms of test results. Say the test is on bilateral integration. What we actually want is that the child improve in that area and be able to demonstrate that improvement with functional skills that they would use in their everyday life. So for example, we might have a goal for the child to pump a swing or cross the monkey bars or use 2 hands with fine motor activities. So the goals would be occupational in nature rather than reductionistic. The next piece is about physical space. So there's adequate room. It can be set up in a flexible arrangement. There's room and safe ways of suspending equipment. There is the possibility for rotational equipment. There's an option for a quiet space that is somewhat removed, like a tent or an adjacent room. And there's an option for some sort of bouncing using bungee cord or other kinds of equipment. And finally, each clinic is different depending on the size and where it's at and access to equipment and supplies and all of that. But this is kind of a laundry list of the things that we would want to see in an Ayres SI clinic or variations on this. So things for bouncing, swings, therapy balls, scooter board, weighted items, crash pads and cushions, a ball pit, things for tactile and vibration, visual targets, inclines or ramps, climbing equipment, rolling equipment, other kinds of props, for example, to add some imaginary play, and things for activities of daily living. We also want to have communication with parents and teachers during this process. So not just once, but ongoing interchanges We want to communicate about sensory integration and praxis effect on activity performance, which I just spoke about, and also the effect of SI and praxis on participation in home, school, and community environments. So we're bringing it back around, right? So SI often is kind of a bottom-up type of intervention where we're working with the neurological systems to result in occupational engagement and participation in activity. So at this point, our communication with parents and teachers brings that all the way around. Here's a sample page from the structural part of the Fidelity Measure. And you can see that it has part 3, which is physical space and equipment, and A is the physical space, and B is the available equipment. And you can see that there is indeed a yes, which gives you 2 points, or a no, which gives you 0 points, and observation notes for every item. And the entire guide is structured in this way. The final thing I want to show you about the structural part of the Fidelity Measure is what's needed to be included in a study. So if we were to want to do research, as I talked about in the beginning, we would want to see certain scores, and a score of 85 or higher is required for inclusion in a study. So about midway down the page, you can see that there's a possible score with all of those areas of 110. And to be included in a research study, 85 is the cutoff. Now we're going to move on to the second part of the Fidelity Measure, the process section. So in the process section, there are 10 areas that we look at, and we'll be covering those briefly. An observer rates the therapist, as I said, and often it's from videotape, or it could be in person, but of course it's easier to videotape oneself and then send it in for rating through a third-party observer. Everything is rated on a scale from 1 to 4, with 4 being the best score you could get. And for each of the areas, there are key elements that are noted, and examples of best practice are provided. So I will, as we go, show you some sample pages. I think I have one sample page that will show you how that works. And as I talk about the various areas, I will give you examples of the key elements and best practice. Okay, so there's going to be 3 slides that have process items, items 1 through 10. And this is the first page, and so it has 3 of those items. The first is ensuring physical safety. So what we want to see is that the therapist anticipates physical hazards and attempts to ensure that the child is physically safe by manipulating the equipment, by helping the child to move into a safer position, etc. A key issue is that the child anticipates the therapist anticipates that the child will move, will play vigorously, and may take risk or want to crash. So we have to be kind of on top of that. We're not reactive, but we're proactive. The second item is presents sensory opportunities. When we're doing sensory integration, we want to present the child with at least 2 of the 3 types of sensory opportunities, tactile, vestibular, or proprioceptive, so that we support the development of self-regulation, sensory awareness, or movement in space. A key issue around this is that during the intervention, the therapist provides a variety of opportunities with varying intensities, qualities, speed, and duration to improve sensory perception and sustain adequate arousal state. So when we break this down, it basically means that the environment is really well set up and that the therapist is skilled enough to provide a number of different options for the child that focus on tactile, vestibular, and proprioceptive, and furthermore, that the therapist is able to grade the activity for duration, intensity, and frequency. You know, there's a cartoon that often goes around in the occupational therapy community with a picture of all these kids that are playing at all this stuff, and it says, you know, the therapist, how come this therapist just gets to play with all these kids all day and, you know, and gets paid for it? And basically, when we're doing our job really well, it looks like play, but when we break it down, it actually is very, very complex. And this idea of presenting sensory opportunities in a skillful way and a graded fashion is one of the ways that we see that complexity. The third piece is that the therapist supports modulation and regulation. Let me just scroll down here in my notes. What we want to see is that the therapist modifies the sensory conditions and challenges and supports so that the child can attain and maintain appropriate levels of arousal and alertness, as well as effective state and activity level that supports engagement in activity. So think about this. We want to help the child attain and maintain appropriate levels of arousal and alertness. So many of our kids come in and they're either very low and slow or they're bouncing off the walls, and we need to get them into a state of alertness and arousal where they can actually engage with the environment and the equipment, find a just right challenge, and make an adaptive response. So this piece is huge. Key issues that are involved are the therapist guiding the session to support functional arousal and affect so that they can ultimately engage in different tasks and activities. Examples, and on this particular item, there's a number of examples. An example would include when the child resists, the therapist backs off from one or more demands. And I've mentored a lot of therapists and observed a lot of therapy, and there's different schools of thought. You know, in some instances, the therapist is much more structured and may have ideas about how the therapy session ought to go to meet the goals that are set out for the child. And so what is allowed and what is not allowed is pretty structured and rigid. With sensory integration, we're not giving children free rein to just like run amok, but at the same time, if the child is resistant to doing something, we're also not pushing through that resistance. We're backing off and finding another way. So that's an example of how the therapist supporting modulation and regulation might work. All right, again, just to give you context, there's 10 process items. They all have to do with what the therapist is doing in the therapeutic situation with a child present, and these are called the process items. So we just discussed the first 3, and now we're going to look at numbers 4, 5, and 6. Number 4 is challenges postural, ocular, oral, and/or bilateral motor control. So on the previous page, we saw that the therapist was going to introduce various kinds of sensory experiences, and now we're looking at motor control issues. So the therapist is going to both support and challenge these areas of motor control, and a key issue is that the therapist challenges the child to participate in sensory motor activities so that he or she can build strength, dexterity, speed, and agility, both in dynamic positions and in static positions and in dynamic situations, and that these can then apply to fine and gross motor skills. An example would be that the therapist offers postural challenges, for example, to head control, to righting or equilibrium reactions, or to static balance. Another example might be that in terms of ocular motor control, that there's challenge that require visual localization of objects during body movement. For example, smoothly using both eyes together to cross the midline, or eye-hand responses towards a visual target. And we'll see when we look at the video, I believe, yes, that the child is targeting from a moving swing, right? So we want to bring in ocular control, oral control, bilateral control, and postural control. Number 5 is that the therapist challenges praxis and behavior organization. The therapist needs to support and presents challenges to the child's ability to conceptualize and plan novel motor tasks and to organize his or her own behavior in time and space. So this has to do with praxis and motor planning, pretty much. What we want to do is to set up situations and to facilitate in such a way that the child is building praxis and motor planning skills in particular, although in some cases ideation or execution of motor is just as important. And at this point, in the Fidelity Measure, there are some notes, and I'll introduce some of these notes here, and just know that they apply to a number of different aspects of the process items. So here it says, if the therapist is attempting to keep the child seated for most or all of the observation period, score a 1. What that's telling us, and what that's kind of putting us on notice about, is that if we're sitting in a seat at a table with the child, we're not doing ASI, right? So with newer therapists especially, I find a lot of times that the therapist really wants to divide the time equally or give more time to the tabletop activities than to the SI piece of things. So maybe 10 minutes in the gym and then we go sit down for the other 40 minutes, right? Or maybe let's do half and half. What I find is that when we are really watching and observing carefully, we can actually tell when the child becomes regulated and is ready to go and sit down. And so for some kids, that may be after 10 or 15 minutes. For other kids, it may be after half of our session, or 25 or 30 minutes. For still other kids, it might be that we do 40 or 45 minutes of ASI work, and then we get this amazing amount of quality fine motor or perceptual motor or executive function skill that happens just in 5 or 7 minutes at the end of the session. Is that valuable? Absolutely. So there's not a recipe for when we switch it up, but we absolutely do not want to be at the table for a majority of the time if we're saying that what we're doing intervention-wise is ASI. Okay, so that went with number 4. The other thing that starts to come up and is noted throughout the rest of the process items is that for a child with autism, severe dyspraxia, and other developmental disabilities that interfere with ideation, initiation, and planning of movement, the therapist may need to provide a great deal of direction and structuring. These children typically lack ideation and organization of behavior. However, the therapist continues to be responsive to the child's initiation of goal-oriented behavior and will shift directives in order to support and encourage the child's initiative. So that is a big mouthful that basically means, with some of our kids on the spectrum, if they have really intense dyspraxia or other developmental disabilities, for example, DCD, we may need to provide a larger magnitude of structure and direction. But by the same token, we need to be really aware that we're not taking over when the child can actually step up and engage in goal-oriented behavior. So we're supporting and we're providing scaffolding, but then we're willing to back up as soon as we see that the child can actually meet the challenge, him or herself. Okay, so those two things, the seated piece and the caveat about particular kids, follow us through the rest of the items. Number 6, collaborates in activity choice. The therapist negotiates activity choices with the child and allows the child to choose equipment, materials, or specific aspects of an activity. Activity choices and sequences are not determined solely by the therapist. So this really separates ASI from other kinds of therapy. In many kinds of therapy, what we do is we choose what the child needs to work on and we work on it. Or we might choose two things and enable the child to have a choice between two things. Within ASI, what we do is we set up an environment and we put out a number of different pieces of equipment or materials, and then we help the child, we collaborate so that the child can make some decisions about what he or she wants to do. Now, this can sometimes be tough, especially if the child has difficulty with initiation. But as much as is possible, we're going to support those innate drives that the child has to go towards a particular kind of activity. All right, and this is our last slide about process items. And once again, just to give you context, there's 10 items. We've gone through 6 of them. And now here are numbers 7 through 10. Number 7 is presenting the just right challenge. And for most of us that have been practicing ASI or sensory integration, we know about this. This is the challenge to the child's postural, ocular, oral, sensory modulation and discrimination or praxis, any of those areas that's not too difficult or too easy for the child to achieve. So it's somewhere right in the middle. And for our kids, that middle place can fluctuate. So it's not as easy as it sounds in some instances. But we're constantly seeking the just right challenge. It's not so easy that they don't have to put forth effort or they might be bored, and it's not so difficult that it drives them off and they're not willing to persist. There's many different ways that we can change things up to present a just right challenge. So, for example, we can add, remove, or rearrange the equipment or materials. We can alter the activity to be more or less demanding. For example, change the child's position, move the target closer, change the height of equipment, etc. We can also, when engaging in a game with rules and a predetermined sequence, we can alter the game by changing the rules or modifying the way that it's played. So those are all different ways that we can get to a just right challenge for that child. And again, it requires careful observation and skill to actually do that within the context of a therapy session. Number 8 is ensuring activities are successful. We want to support the child's ability to respond successfully. The child may not always be 100% successful, but let's face it, our kids are used to failing, and they're used to being the last, and they're used to not being picked, and they're used to not being able to do all of the things that other kids can do at the same level as those other kids. So we're going to present an entire environment of success. The key issue here is that the child experience success in doing part or all of an activity. Success is not defined as compliance or adherence to an exercise program, and the therapist may alter the activity at any point in the activity sequence to assure success. What this means is that we need to be flexible, and I know for me, sometimes I have a really preconceived notion of what should happen, and I need to check myself and say, aha, I need to be flexible in this situation. For example, I hung that swing up too high, or I used the swing that was way too wiggly and we should change it out. Or let's move closer together to do this ball activity, and then as we move through it, we'll move farther apart each time we catch. So what we're going to do is we're going to, again, grade activities so that the child is successful. Number 9 is supporting a child's intrinsic motivation to play. So we know that play is one of a child's main occupations, and it's intrinsically motivated. We don't pay kids money to play. We don't necessarily, typically we don't give them any rewards to play, like we don't say, oh, you can have gum if you play for the next 10 minutes, or you can have a goldfish cracker. The play itself is intrinsically motivating. In other words, it comes from inside the child, and the actual play is its own reward. So we're going to support that so that the child is fully engaged in the intervention. A key issue is the therapist values and builds upon a child's intrinsic motivation and enjoyment of activities, and that we allow the child to explore or experiment with actions or objects. We can support play through both verbal and nonverbal messages, and in some cases, the nonverbal is even more powerful than the verbal. Sometimes as therapists, we can get caught up in saying, good job, good job, good job. And at a certain point, kids cease to respond to that. So we want to really change up and experiment with how we're providing positive reinforcement. Play may involve social reciprocity. It may involve motor activity, object play, imaginative play, a fantasy storyline or theme. It could be very simple or very complex. So it behooves us to know about play and play theory so that we can support the many different kinds of play that there are and meet the child where he or she is at with play. The last process item is establishing therapeutic alliance. The therapist promotes and establishes a connection with the child that conveys a sense of working together towards one or more goals in a mutually enjoyable partnership. Yes, we're the adult and they're the kid, and yes, we have the power in the situation and they don't on some level. However, when we build rapport and we build mutual trust with our clients, they are going to be more engaged, and we are actually going to be more easily able to facilitate their skill building. A key issue is that the therapist and child relationship goes beyond pleasantries and feedback on performance, such as praise or instruction. We also want to show respect for the child's emotion, convey positive regard toward the child, display empathy with the child's abilities and struggles, and create a climate of trust and emotional safety. So the therapeutic alliance goes so much deeper than just saying good job or just giving instructions to the kid about what they need to do next. We're really respecting where they're at and building a sense of mutual positive regard and kind of unconditional acceptance of the child, regardless of what they can do and what they can't do. All right, so here's a sample page of the process elements. This is process element number 5, challenges, praxis, and organization of behavior. And I just wanted to show it to you because it shows you that up on the top, there's a definition of the ratings. Again, they go from 4 to 1, and 4 is the highest, and 1 is not really using the strategy. And then each item has key issues and has any notes, and sometimes has examples of ways that this process item might be enacted in a therapy session. Okay, so we've made it through the fidelity measure, and at this point what I'm going to do, or at least attempt to do, is share a video with you. There won't be sound. I will be talking over it. Hopefully you're not sick of the sound of my voice yet. And then we'll have time for questions. So there'll be about 5-6 minutes of video and then about 15 minutes for questions at the end. So Katie, if you could please turn off the recording, we'll go ahead with the video.